Biography and Comment, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. Poems by John Clare. Biography and Comment by Norman Gale. Part 1. In tracing the origin of John Clare, it is not necessary to go very far back, reference to his grandfather and grandmother being a sufficient acknowledgment of the claims of genealogy. Following the road at haphazard, trusting himself entirely to the guidance of fortune, and relying for provender upon his skill in drawing from a violin tunes of the battle and the dance, about 30 years before Helpston heard the first wail of its infant poet, there arrived at the village the vagabond and truculent Parker. Born under a wandering star, this man had footed it through many a country of Europe, careless whether daily necessity required from him an act of bloodshed or the scraping of a harum-scarum reel designed to set frolic in the toes of man and maid. At the time of his reaching Helpston, a Northamptonshire village, destined to come into prominence because of the lyrics of its chief son, it happened that the children were without a schoolmaster. In his time the adventurer had played many parts. Why should he not add to the list? Effrontery, backed up by an uncertain amount of superficial attainment, won the day, and this fiddling Odysseus obtained the vacant position. Of his boastings, his bowings, his drinkings, there is no need to make history, but his soft tongue demands a moment of attention. We may take it for granted that he picked out the fairest flower among the maids of Helpston as the target for all the darts at his disposal, each of which, we may be sure, was polished by use. The daughter of the parish clerk was a fortress easy to capture. Depicted by himself, the rascal loomed as a hero, till at last the affair proceeded beyond a mere kiss, and the poor girl pleaded for the offices of a priest in order to save her child from the stain of illegitimacy. However, the schoolmaster proved glib of promises, but fleet of foot, for on the day following his sweetheart's revelations he was nowhere to be found. In the course of time, John Clare's father was born. In his turn, he grew into the want of a mate, found her, married her, and begot an honour for England. John Clare was born at Helpston on the 13th day of July, 1793, and born into a heritage of handicaps, to say nothing of the fruits of exposure to rough weathers which were ripening in his father's system. The boy had the disadvantage of being one of twins, a sister accompanying him into the world. His mother suffered from dropsy, and we may well believe that what life the children sucked from her breast contained elements threatening their future health. Small and frail, the lad had the additional misfortune to open his eyes in the cottage of a pauper, instead of in some abode where his natural weakness could have been nourished by foods giving inward encouragement, and of a sort sure to result in the building up of hearty fibre. Despite all these early rebuffs, John Clare kept hold of life. When still very young, he set out full of faith to explore the junction of earth and heaven, for on the horizon he could see the point of their meeting. In this incident, as well as in many another of his childhood, it is easy to detect signs of a spirit triumphantly unfitted for residence in a clay hovel at Helpston. As luck would have it, a kind of rough-and-ready poetry was not altogether out of the boy's reach, for his father's head was stuffed with innumerable odds and ends of rhyme, some of which he was in the habit of reciting to his son. Entertainment of the same sort was obtainable from old Granny Baines, a weather-worn cowherd, to whom the future poet was attracted by her store of ditties, whose especial cronies were the wind and rain. Under such illiterate tutors little John Clare moved closer and closer to the soul of poetry, musing while he put a limit to the vagrancy of the geese and sheep for which he had been appointed guardian as soon as the main part of his schooling was over. His departure from the scholastic bench took place when his years had reached a very unripe total, for with only 7 birthdays entered in his book of life, at an age when a child is usually at the commencement of historical and geographical perplexities, he was turned out into the fields as a wage earner. Instead of feeling elated at his escape from the scholastic coils of Dame Bullimore, as many a lad would have done, John Clare, being aware of his budding wits, although unable to comprehend the motive force from within, looked round his small district in search of fresh educational territories to be conquered by his brain. Having saved a few pence, he made overtures to Mr. James Merryshaw, the schoolmaster of Glinton, and in the duller months of the year, when days were short, he attended certain evening classes, notwithstanding the fact that the journeys involved taxed his boot leather severely, for Glinton is nearly 5 miles away from Helpston. Here he learned well, but not altogether wisely, if we may agree that the boy's struggles with the intricacies of algebra were conspicuous for misapplied energy. But something more valuable than baffling equations resulted from John Clare's connection with the sage of Glinton, for Mr. Merryshaw made him free of his books, thus feeding more and more that desire for knowledge which sprang up in him not less rapidly than a mushroom grows in a meadow. Even in such a loose piece of biography as this, an essay which has no other aim than to glance in passing at the salient features of Clare's career, a little space must be spared for mention of the boy's year of service as factotum at the Bluebell at Helpston, where he had almost as much leisure as work, because it was here that his hermitical notions and moods of dream increased at an extraordinary rate. Served by travelling pedlars whose packs let him share in fancy the terror of Red Riding Hood, the adventures of Valentine and Orson, to say no word of Sinbad's amazements, the small student entered for the first time into the recesses of fairyland, there to lave his hands in its abundant jewels, while making extortionate demands upon the swiftness of genies. Little by little algebra went to the wall, yielding as much to the boy's spreading passion for nature's feast of grass and flowers as for the limitless enchantments born of imagination, since at this period the list of impulses communicated to him by wayside blossoms, by clouds, by winds, and by the easy ballads of thrushes, daily grew longer. The boy began to appreciate the largeness of God's school as compared with the limits reigned over by Dame Bullimore and the pedagogue of Glinton, and his increasing sense of hearing enabled him to receive into his understanding fragments of those sermons which are preached by stones. Hunger for expansion lived and lusted in his heart. No better example of this fury of craving could be adduced than the story of how the young poet entered into a combat with circumstances in order that he might obtain a copy of Thomson's Seasons. Mental agony, as well as a superlative degree of hoarding, went to the purchase of that coveted volume, the history of which is fully set forth in Mr. Frederick Martin's stimulating Life of John Clare. During these glowing months the boy of genius had not ceased from utilizing every chance scrap of paper for the purpose of jotting down his exercises in rhyme. By means of a forgivable trick, he secured the verbal patronage of his father and mother, who could not see any merit in his verses till he pretended that they were the compositions of others. As poem after poem was written, their author stored them in a cranny in the wall, a retreat at last invaded by Mrs. Clare, with the result that she was wont to help the boiling of the kettle by burning underneath it the early pipings of her son. At this point the youth in whose story the interest lies being 16 years old, Cupid, with no loss of his bright qualities after so many centuries of exercise, comes into the recital. To John Clare, who was moving rapidly towards the full worship of all things lovely, Mary Joyce appeared to be nobody less bewildering and enchanting than a stray from heaven, and though he was prevented from wearing her, the dice of fortune falling adverse from the box, he never ceased to regard her as his ideal. Of the many pathetic incidents of his life, Not the least touching is the fact that in his years of a broken brain he cherished as a chief delusion the belief that Mary Joyce was indeed his wife. What the feelings of a nature so intense were when the father of his sweetheart intervened, as the proverbial slip between the cup and the lip, we can only conjecture, though the tracing of results is easy enough. After leaving the tankards and the horses of the Bluebell, John Clare cast about him for some other form of employment. Escaping the pains of stone-cutting and cobbling, he succeeded in becoming a gardener's apprentice at Burley Park, the seat of the Marquess of Exeter. Parker Clare began to think that his son was born with an invisible silver spoon in his mouth, while to John 8 shillings a week, with lodging free, smacked of the robber's cave in the Arabian Nights. In reality this position was altogether undesirable, for the head gardener, not content to degrade himself alone by an excessive swallowing of stimulants, actually devoted his best efforts to make drunkards of his pupils. Unfortunately, temptation loomed large at the very moment when Clare was ripe for mischief. Romance was worsted by swipes. The indignity of the episode may be held to excuse the slang. By means of such thin nepenthe, regret for the loss of Mary Joyce grew less and less, and it not infrequently occurred that the new apprentice slept off his potations by the hedge-side, with no better blanket than a mist, and with the damp turf for sole mattress, thus unconsciously taking in a cargo of ague and fever for future unloading. At last Clare, in company with another lad who was anxious to show a clean pair of heels to the abstract and concrete brutalities of his master, fled to Grantham, and thence to Newark-upon-Trent, where both the runaways obtained work under a nurseryman. But Clare was homesick. His mother's face was as a magnet, pulling him to the familiar hovel at Helpston. No longer could he obey that decree of divorce from his native scenes, pronounced against him by the impalpable judge and jury of circumstance. One day, after a terrible journey on foot, he burst into the hut of his parents, weeping for joy to gain for his body the residence which his spirit had occupied so long. No sooner had Clare returned his muscles to the various tasks of a farm labourer than he harked back with a love greater than ever to Thomson's Seasons, reading it as he went to and from his work. The chief part of his leisure he used for the composition of verses, an occupation which served to fix upon him habits of timidity and shyness, especially as he was without a single sympathizer. Because of his strange manners, his fits of abstraction, as well as of uttered enthusiasm, his appetite for solitude, the neighbours passed from mere mockery to whispers of a mind diseased, and even of a nature beset by the black ministers of magic. The fact that about this time his mother, for the purposes of fuel, made a clean sweep of his poetic accumulations, did its share to loosen his moral control, and when his attempts at gaining encouragement from Mr. Thomas Porter, and patronage from Lord Milton, to whom the parish clerk of Helpston displayed the rustic poet, failed, he betook himself, this time of his own accord, to the drunken company of the worst livers in the village. Much of Clare's future misery proceeded from this lapse. Before bad example had done its utmost to ruin him, Providence, in the somewhat unusual disguise of a recruiting sergeant, came to the rescue. John's period of military service was brief, for after being instructed at Oundle in the goose step, that foundation of a glorious career under arms, the corps of which he was a member was disbanded, and he was enabled once more to assume the civilian smock at Helpston. For all booty he had a second-rate copy of Paradise Lost and The Tempest. A matter of more importance, however, was the fact that he had departed from the pernicious influence of the roisterers who were leading him to destruction. A number of small adventures were not slow to follow his short intimacy with the clothes and tools of war. What with his trial of a gypsy's life, and his courting of several girls, one of whom, Elizabeth Newton by name, drove him into a fit of melancholy by playing the part of a jilt. In this state of mind nothing could have suited him better than change of scene, and his departure to Bridge Casterton, there to learn the details of a lime-burner's trade, happened at a moment fortunate for heart and head alike. It was while he resided in this neighbourhood that he confided to Mr. Henson, a bookseller of Market Deeping, the fact of his colloquy with the Muse, following the avowal by a display of his powers. This confession was the germ of a wide circulation. And now we are arrived at a fresh, and as far as matrimony is concerned, a final love. Clare being now 24 years of age, it was high time for him to nurse an established affection, and he was lucky to win the heart of Martha Turner, the Patty of several poems to be found in the collected works of the poet. To him, Martha was another waif from the skies, even though she tortured her poetical admirer by the time-honored practice of appearing to waver between two suitors. The conduct of this episode was made up of petty events, prosaic enough to the onlooker, but sufficiently lethal for the parties most interested. Tiffs, sour looks from parents, despairs, showers, rainbows, were the constituents of Clare's courtship. A flat and always fortunate wooing would doubtless have been hostile to poetry. Because of his longing to supply two mouths with the necessaries of life, and because it was clearly proved that Cupid would not even be able to munch a satisfactory portion of crust if the lovers founded their faith solely on the wage of a lime-burner, Clare conceived the idea of publishing a volume of song, his mind appointing Mr. Henson of Market Deeping a comrade for his project. A month devoted to the base uses of the treadmill would not have cost the poet more labour than did the composition of his prospectus, 300 copies of which the bookseller agreed to print, as well as a specimen sonnet for £1. But this trap for subscribers was baited with too much candour. If ever a poet met with a crushing response to his first appeal for a hearing, surely John Clare was that man. 7 patrons came forward, more, we may guess, in kindness than in hope of literary luxury. Clare, of course, experienced the superlatives of disgust, and when the printer of the artless prospectus wrote to inform him that the adventure must drop unless £15 appeared to back it up, he could not withhold himself from replying in a strain to the last degree impolitic. To add to his griefs, a rather wide gulf was at this time yawning between Martha Turner and himself, the bridging of which was a feat of engineering extremely hard to accomplish. Moreover, and here is an illustration of the proverb that it never rains but it pours, the owner of the lime-kilns discharged his lyrical servant on the score of his inattention to business, the whole neighbourhood being somewhat scandalized at what was considered presumption, for labourers of Clare's type were not required to assert themselves in prose, much less in poetry. The disappointed lime-burner, with a heart given up to aching, returned once more to Helpston, where he would have starved but for parochial relief. So Genius sat down to eat the parish loaf. However tightly twisted the rosebud may be, windy and sunny fingers will unpack it at last, at the very moment when Clare was reading himself as the peculiar prey of disaster. He was destined to behold the bright back of the cloud which had confronted him with such ominous persistence. By strange approaches, the news of Clare's devotion to and production of poetry arrived at Mr. Drury, a bookseller who was on the point of taking over a business at Stamford from Mr. Thompson of that town. In company with a friend, Mr. Drury proceeded to Helpston, interviewed the astonished poet, glanced through some rhymed samples, and finally declared his intention to publish a volume at his own risk. Hearing which intelligence, Clare once more rose heavenward in the balloon of hope, forgetting how certain it was that impediments to free flight would make themselves manifest. Owing to the offices of Mr. Drury, Clare became acquainted with Mr. Gilchrist of Stamford, a gentleman with an Oxford education and a grocer's shop, who played the part of a true friend to the poet, if we accept his action in making public some verses of Clare's which had more wine than inspiration in them. It has been contended that Mr. Gilchrist filled the post of patron with a want of reserve which made Clare feel his position acutely, for the eating of humble pie has never been a really popular amusement. Be this as it may, lovers of poems descriptive of rural life and scenery have a great deal for which to thank Mr. Gilchrist. After promising Clare to undertake the publication of his first book, Mr. Drury experienced a few bad hours. To begin with, the ill-spelt, rope-tied, unpunctuated mass of manuscript entrusted to him by its author had a most unpromising aspect. He tested it as best he could, but, as the glow of the adventure had already faded a little, found no particular reasons for comfort. In this strait he enlisted the acumen of an acquaintance, a clergyman, whose name was, somewhat appropriately, Twopenny, in order to see how the verses might strike a contemporary. The prophetic Twopenny, with brutal candour, described Clare's bundle of reeds to be so much twaddle. When Mr. Drury delivered this oracle, the grief of the poet was such that the bookseller was shocked. Had it not been for the anguish of the singer, it is quite possible that the bookseller of Stamford would have departed, with decent circuity, from his bargain. As it was, he determined to procure yet another opinion. He happened to be a relative of Mr. John Taylor, the London publisher, to whom he dispatched the uncouth manuscript in question. Mr. Taylor's were not as Mr. Twopenny's eyes. He knew diamonds when he saw them, even though a polisher had not exerted his craft upon them. End of Part 1.
Biography and Comment, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Poems by John Clare. Biography and Comment by Norman Gale, Part 2. Before proceeding to describe the effect made on the public by the appearance of Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery, it will be necessary to revert for a moment to the affairs of love. No sooner was the first quarrel between the sweethearts swept away by the broom of reconciliation than the flame of passion, burning to a conquering height, made a bonfire out of the broken materials of virtue. This disaster was followed by fresh bickerings. Martha Turner found it impossible to be for ever displaying a cheerful front. Her tears, her reproaches, her simple tricks to make Clare jealous resulted in a serious breach. Clare, listening far too readily to glib and evil persuasions from within, appears to have convinced himself that he was the injured party, whereupon he began to wound Martha by flirting outrageously with Betty Selle, the daughter of a Southwark labourer. This inglorious behaviour received a sudden check just after the publication of Clare's book, by reason of a letter from Martha Turner, in which she spoke of her coming motherhood, and implored the author of her shame to cleanse her in so far as he was able. Truth to tell, Clare was by this time well nigh assured that Betty was his favourite, but he had the manliness to follow the right star, and on the 16th of March, 1820, was united to Martha at Great Caserton Church. A month after the wedding, Anna Maria Clare was born to him. As this marriage would hardly have been possible but for the stir occasioned by the poems, we may now give a short history of the events immediately following their issue. Although the art of preliminary puffing was as yet in swaddling clothes, so to speak, Mr. Taylor contrived to interest a large number of his acquaintances, some of whom had access to the columns of certain periodicals. Moreover, Mr. Gilchrist's magazine article had proved a useful forerunner. The book itself was born into a golden clime. The reading world happened to be sick of metropolitan and modish fare. Clare's birds and May blossoms came as a tonic to all who were desirous of a change. The triumph of the country over the town was of the completest sort. Customers poured into Mr. Taylor's shop in their anxiety to purchase copies of the labourer's poems. For once the critics and the public were agreed. Journals of fine stature joined with insignificant prints in praising Clare to the skies, and when this new writer actually succeeded in carrying the defences of the Quarterly, it was allowed on all sides that lion hunters were in luck's way. Clare was the fortunate in some of his advertisers. Rossini and Madame Vestris brought him into further prominence by means of a musical setting and of recitations at Covent Garden. Genius in hobnailed boots and a smock frock shouldered aside the more usual figures of literary London. While all this was taking place in Fleet Street, as well as in the aristocratic sections of the capital, rumours of Clare's amazing success reached the county residences in the neighbourhood of Helpstone. General Birch Reynardson gave him to eat with his lackeys, and Viscount Milton flung 17 guineas into his lap with as much feeling as he might have thrown 17 crumbs to a cur. In great contrast to blue-blooded vulgarity of this stamp was the Marquis of Exeter's treatment of the poet. Although a more liberal display of tact upon his part would have enabled Clare to leave his mansion with a heart given over completely to joy and gratitude. Friends of Clare are not likely to forget the generosity of the Marquis. An annuity of 15 guineas for life was indeed a handsome backing of the Muse. Because of this gift, Anna Maria Clare was born in wedlock. Without it her parents would not have been able to marry as soon as they did. Foolish folk spared the poet none of the customary agonies. He was pestered by inquisitive visitors. Collectors of autographs bullied him for his signature, and the owners of albums plagued him to encourage them in their whim. Some persons of the goody-goody type improved the shining hour by sending him an assortment of tracts, the fate of which is wrapped in impenetrable mystery. Clare was a simple child of nature, certainly, but we may almost take it for granted that he left these precious effusions undigested. The news that Clare was about to trust his bones to London almost paralyzed his rustic intimates. Generations of romancers had made strange impressions upon the provincial mind. Particularly full of odious vaticinations was James Burrage, an old farm labourer whose head was stuffed to the bursting point with stories horrifying enough to make Clare's flesh creep. According to this authority, London thoroughly deserved the doubtful compliment of being compared with Babylon. He declared that there were trap-doors in the streets, down which wayfarers flopped into cauldrons of boiling water, amid the plaudits of ministering cutthroats. Clare quailed, his parents wept, and his wife approached within measurable distance of hysterics. But even the prospect of being cooked in this casual manner did not suffice to deter the poet from visiting Mr. Taylor, of Fleet Street. That he set some value upon the legends of James Burrage is proved by his adoption of a small device to baffle the trapdoor operators. Believing safety to be resident in a smock frock and in boots the soles of which sustained grinning rows of hobnails, he set forth upon his journey thus attired. He was not long in regretting his precautions, for he soon perceived that his costume evoked from onlookers merry comments and derisive glances. In the end, Mr. Taylor supplied him with an overcoat which covered the defects of his attire. Whatever the heat of theatre or drawing room, whether among lords or commoners, John Clare clung to this garment with the courage of despair. What his agonies were, because of his raiment, when driven into a corner by a countess for a tete-a-tete, we can do no more than dimly conjecture. In the course of this visit, Clare was introduced to Admiral Lord Radstock, who took a great fancy to him and remained a firm friend, and to Mrs. Emerson, a lady who, seeing that her purse and sympathies were always ready to alleviate the mischances of young poets and artists, might be described as a female Maenas. To this rather gushing and sentimental patroness of the arts, Clare from time to time addressed letters which were not devoid of the elements of wildness and platonic passion. At last his emphasis became so absurd that Mrs. Emerson requested him to send back her portrait. Had a jug of cold water been poured down the poet's neck, he could not have been more cooled than he was by this piece of diplomacy. The shrine was despoiled. The picture was dispatched by the next carrier, and doubtless Martha, who must have hated the sight of Mrs. Emerson's face, congratulated herself in secret. There is no need to say more about Clare's first visit to London, if we except mention of the fact that the mighty city's chief effect upon him was to fill his breast with yearning for the oaks and rivulets round about his native village. A week in the metropolis had been more than enough for the countryman. As he rumbled homeward in the coach, he had dreams of unsullied waters and unsmoked rainbows, and he counted over his country joys as a miser adds up the total of his various coins. At the top of his treasures stood his wife and baby, for, with all his platonic declensions from the state most comfortable to Martha, he was an affectionate husband and father. About this time several hearty friends strove with might and main to secure a competence for the poet. A sum of £420 was the result of their earnestness. But when it is remembered that Earl Fitzwilliam and Clare's publishers were between them responsible for no less than 200 of this amount, the harvest of solicitation is not notable for bounteousness. Dr. Bell, a friend of the right complexion, extracted an annual £10 from Earl Spencer, so that, what with this gift, the Marquis of Exeter's donation, and the fund, the genius of Helpstone was possessed of an income of £45 per annum. Clare felt a very menacent throughout all these transactions, and even went so far as to disavow them in letters dispatched to his noble helpers. Had it not been for the persuasions of Mr. Gilchrist and the amusing invectives of Dr. Bell, he would have kicked with greater persistence against the pricks of charity. As soon as the harvest was over, Clare made an end of labouring in the fields. He was under agreement to hand over another volume of poetry to Messrs. Taylor and Hennessy for publication early in 1821. It was now his earnest endeavour to fulfil his share of the bargain, and he bared his forehead to inspiration. Clare always felt himself cheated and empty of ideas when shut up within four walls. The Muse would not follow him to his fireside, but she would frolic with him in the livelong day in the open air, filling him with buoyancy, kissing his lips, and smoothing out his wrinkles. Seated inside an old oak, whose heart had gradually passed into the atmosphere, Clare was wont to pour his soul in song, and so fruitful were the hints of his unseen companion that he soon had a great collection of new verses. All that he approved he desired to publish, but Mr. Taylor spoke a few strong words in favour of weeding, suggesting to Clare that he should play the part of Herod towards some of the children of his imagination. A deadlock ensued. For a time the poet was adamant, the publishers marble. In this difficulty Clarke bethought himself of Mr. Gilchrist as an excellent agent for the casting of oil on the troubled waters. This gentleman, however, was thick in the squabble of his own, and when Clare appeared unsympathetic he displayed a spirit very much huffed. At last the tension between poet and publishers became less, with the result that in the middle of September the Village Minstrel was ready for purchasers. The 2 volumes were handsomely presented, the type was beautiful, and a couple of steel engravings made a brave show. Despite the attractions of genius, despite the various ornaments, the Village Minstrel met with rather an icy greeting. Among the several explanations of this coldness put forward by the publishers and by certain friends, the likeliness is that the season of issue was not wisely chosen. In this year such gods of the pen as Scott, Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth, Keats, and Lamb distributed joy to many a reader, so that poor John Clare naturally ran a great risk of being overlooked. It was now proved how dangerous had been the heat of his first welcome. Superlatives had been done to death. The lion hunters had exhausted their Treckley compliments, and were now eagerly scanning the literary horizon in the hope of seeing a fresh victim. Moreover, some injudicious persons had descanted more upon Clare's poverty than upon his remarkable powers. It was the general opinion, as Mr. Martin points out in his biography, that a really capable poet should be able to support himself. If he did not succeed in so doing, then he was but a dabbler while pretending to be a priest. The logic was of the sort to shrink from scrutiny, but it contented the shallow sufficiently well. To my thinking, the charge of 12 shillings for these 2 volumes was a factor in the neglect which overtook them. Be this as it may, a collection of verse containing some exquisite and lovely pieces, and marking in some respects an advance upon the forerunning book, fell upon the stony patch of indifference, there to remain while verse of 50 times less merit enjoyed a vogue out of proportion to its worth. In a word, Clare's second luck was the exact opposite of his first. In days saddened by the reflection that he had failed to hold by the glory which he obtained at his first venture, it was balm to Clare to know that Robert Bloomfield at least warmly approved of what lukewarm triflers failed to appreciate. In the summer of 1821, not long after the meteoric appearance at Helpstone of a minor poet, who presented Clare with a sonnet and a £1 note in a glorious burst of bounty and condescension, Mr. John Taylor passed a few hours in the little Northamptonshire village. Under the guidance of Clare he reviewed many of the spots which the poet had celebrated in song, and in some cases he was amazed to find how Clare had compelled dull localities to yield strains both abundant and beautiful. But to gather roses in a desert is child's play for a genius. Upon taking leave, Mr. Taylor invited Clare to spend a few weeks in Fleet Street. Luckily the poet decided to avail himself of this offer, for about this time he was far too frequent a visitor at the Bluebell, where he had his corner reserved, and passed for the chief of the assembly. This meant more than sufficient exercise for the gullet. The bad habit contracted at Burghley Hall was strengthened at these sittings, and Clare, deplorably unstable in some mental particulars, approached nearer and nearer to that abyss which had engulfed so many great wits. The winter being over, Clare departed for London. He was something of a bolt from the blue to Mr. Taylor, but that gentleman was not slow in welcoming his client, though he looked askance at the gay pocket handkerchief in which contained the whole of his friend's luggage. As the publisher was very busy, he delivered Clare into the keeping of Thomas Hood, who, in turn, handed him over to the head porter of the firm. The poet was not long in finding his way to the house of Mrs. Emerson, whose hospitality was as frank and unstinted as ever. Here Clare met Mr. Rippingill, a young artist with a dash of Dick Swiveller in him, who had a strong appetite for noisy pranks. In company with this unreflective spirit, the peasant from the Midlands attended some very dubious functions, penetrating to quarters of the metropolis which were famous for the topmost achievements of rascality, where he ran riot among various intoxicants. After besieging a certain beauteous actress with all the languishing glances at their command, these foolish comrades would pledge her in pale ale till, like Byron, they seemed to walk upon the ceiling. Thus were Beatrices added to Clare's unfortunate predilection. Those who revel by gaslight are not fond of returning home before midnight, and Clare was no exception to the rule. But the hours of his choice were not grateful to Mr. Taylor, whose sense the fitness of things was offended by his visitor's conduct. Therefore Thomas Hood was deputed to inform Clare that he was vexing his host, an intimation which resulted in the poet carrying his handkerchief full of belongings to Mrs. Emerson's house, where his manners did not improve. Under the accomplished tuition of Mr. Rippingill, he found how easily the descent of avarice was. His next move was to Chiswick, where the Rev. H. T. Carey entertained him. His stay here was brief, owing to an amusing episode. Strangely enough, Clare was ignorant of the fact that his elderly host had a young and handsome wife. In the belief that he was doing homage to the charms of one of Mr. Carey's grown-up daughters, he addressed several poems, which were not without the quality of ardor, to the wife of the translator's bosom. After this, although his explanation was accepted and understood, Clare thought he had better depart from Chiswick. During this stay in London, the Northamptonshire poet was introduced to William Gifford and Charles Lamb, the latter of whom, if report may be trusted, was guilty of a rather coarse jape at his expense. Not long after this, Clare returned to Helpstone. It is worthy to note that, whereas his first visit to London had only accentuated his country raptures. The village minstrel now actually pined for the fatted calves, the theatres, the glitter, and the merry companions of the city. The taint of Ripponville was upon him. Reaction came in time. The meadows captured him again. But this small piece of history is significant of much. As soon as he was once more in possession of his best self, Clare began to face his troubles, most of which sprang from insufficient means at this time. With as much courage as he could summon, he was rather slow in being convinced that he could not derive a steady income from the composition of poetry, but when this truth was driven home, his mind at once became agile in devising numerous plans for the betterment of his state, for he suffered from a torturing anxiety when he remembered for how many his fate had appointed him the bread-winner. He was now fighting hand to hand with poverty, valorous in belief that his aged mother, his wife, and his little children, who enjoyed the fruits of whatever victories were gained far more than did their defender, since he secretly starved himself in order to increase the tale of loaves presided over by Paddy. In the year 1823, worn out by his failures to extract a supporting flow of guineas from either poetry or agriculture, he fell very ill, just after the shock occasioned by the death of Mr. Gilchrist. His recovery was of the slowest, and it was not till he was put by Mr. Taylor under the care of Dr. Darling in London that the poet mended in a manner to satisfy his friends. It was during this third visit to the metropolis that Clare came in contact with De Quincey, Coleridge, William Hazlitt, and Allan Cunningham, to mention only four of the prominent men whom Mr. Taylor delighted to make members of his evening parties. Clare found his imaginary portraits to be very deceptive, especially so in the case of Dr. De Quincey. The bulk and dull appearance of Coleridge also surprised, as well as disappointed him, for he had pictured the great man in a guise completely opposite to reality. There is little need to say that in Mr. Taylor's house nothing of a Bachelanian tinge was likely to occur, but even the moderate pleasures of the publisher's entertainments threatened to destroy the good brought about by the skill and care of Dr. Darling, and therefore Clare was induced to return to Helpstone, where he once more renewed his search for employment, encountered thoughtless snubs from the high and mighty of the district, and gradually approached the line which separates mental health from mental disease. He was forever engaged in keeping the wolf from the door. He did not eat a due share of what his means supplied, denying himself from day to day with rigidity which could not fail to injure both body and brain. At the end of the year 1825, after working in the cornfields throughout the harvest, Clare turned to the composition of poetry, and produced the Shepherd's Calendar, a volume in which he used the file to excellent purpose. Already bruised and wounded by the rough edges of life, the poet found an additional hardship in the fact that Mr. Taylor long delayed to publish this third book of verse, for to make both ends meet was now a miracle beyond its accomplishing. Although several editors of those elegant annuals which were then so much in favour had asked Clare to assist in making their sugary volumes attractive, they were by no means quick to send him the money he had earned. He had only his annuity and a few shillings gained by doing odd jobs for the farmers of the neighbourhood. At this juncture Patty bore him a third child. End of part 2. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Biography and Comment, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Poems by John Clare. Biography and Comment by Norman Gale. Part 3. In 1828 Clare went to London again at the invitation of Mrs. Emerson, and it was then that he discovered how completely the Shepherd's Calendar had failed to stir the interest of the public. It was during this visit that Mr. Taylor, doubtless believing the open-air exercise would be most beneficial to the poet, suggested to Clare the advisability of his attempting to dispose of his works by carrying them from house to house in Northamptonshire and the adjoining counties. Allan Cunningham was furious at the idea, but in the end Clare embraced it, though it had been better for him had he held the same opinion as his friend, for the adventure was prolific of more kicks than halfpence. The history of this part of Clare's career makes very sad reading. Hungry and footsore he tramped from rebuff to rebuff, pondering misery and dreading the workhouse. But though the record of his travels is, for the most part, a document of disaster, there are few proofs of kindliness contained in its pages. For example, when he returned to Helpstone from Boston, where certain of the leading inhabitants had done their best to render him extremely uncomfortable, he found 10 sovereigns in his wallet. A few young men had treated him as Joseph treated his brethren. For 3 months after his experiences at Boston, Clare was exceedingly ill, and it looked as if there would be no ebbing of that tide of misfortune which had flowed in his direction for so long. Better luck, however, was in store. Clare got some regular work to do, and was thus prevented from poring over foolscap. Little by little he reduced his debts. His body throve in the sunshine of content, and he was able to comfort himself with the belief that, after all, he would escape the degradation of becoming a pauper. Unfortunately, a hard winter followed the summer and autumn during which he had been so happy, and illness once more caused him to renew acquaintance with those bitter familiars of his, want and despair. About this time he chanced to have a conversation with Earl Fitzwilliam, with the result that his patron promised to build him a cottage somewhere near Helpstone. The exact place decided upon by his lordship was Northborough, a hamlet 3 miles distant from Helpstone. The situation was chosen in spirit of kindness, the Earl believing that many natural beauties to be found almost at the door of the cottage would please the eye as well as stimulate the genius of the poet. But the prospect of being severed from the bleak surroundings of his native place filled Clare with sensations of terror acute enough to make a severe effect upon his mind. For days before the final wrench came he strode about the lanes and fields, outwardly exhibiting symptoms of a deranged intellect. But when the hour for departure struck, he allowed himself to be led to his new home as placidly as a tired horse to the pasture. So far from proving a blessing to Clare, the cottage at Northborough was the immediate cause of fresh perplexities. Expenditure was necessary to finish it, and to keep it in repair. Debts were quickly piled one upon the other. Among strangers it was harder to obtain employment than it had been at Helpstone, and in the January of 1833 Patty bore her 7th child. At the thought that he could scarcely provide his dear ones with bread enough to keep body and soul together, Clare, shortly after hearing the news of his boy's birth, rushed out into the fields to give his sorrow vent. Late in the evening his eldest daughter found him lying insensible on an embankment. A month of bed followed this collapse. In the spring, although his vital forces were now sufficient to carry him in search of the early flowers, he showed no inclination to leave the little room where he kept his books and papers. The irresistible magnets of former years, blossoms, birds, greenery, and sunshine, had all lost their pulling power. Clare himself perceived that he was in danger of ceasing to be his own master, and accordingly wrote to Mr. Taylor begging him to secure Dr. Darling's help. In reply, his old publisher invited him to London, but the poet neither had money in his purse nor a single chance of raising the amount necessary to defray the costs of the journey. Messrs. Whitaker and Company, who were responsible for the appearance of the Rural Muse, declined to send him even a small sum on account, so that he was tied fast to Northborough, where his mental malady had everything in its favour. Had it not been for the untiring exertions of Dr. Smith, of Peterborough, who mingled poetry and pills in his advice to patients, thus obtaining a goodly list of subscribers, it is doubtful whether the Rural Muse would have made its appearance before Clare was overcome by permanent imbecility. In the summer of 1835 this beautiful collection of rustic reeds was put forward as a candidate for the affection of those professing a love for music and wholesomeness in verse. The reception accorded to the book proved conclusively what important parts fashion and hypocrisy play in the concerns of the lyre. Clare was out of vogue. He was a stale lion. The parasites upon genius could no longer hope to gain a temporary notoriety by displaying his peculiarities in their saloons. The idea of reading poetry for the sake of poetry appears never to have occurred to the members of a society as ponderable, in the matter of intellect, as thistledown, and as variable as the sheen of an opal. It is a moot point whether or no the reviewers wrote notices of the Rural Muse. If they did their duty, the editors certainly did not back them up by granting space for the criticisms, for scarcely a paragraph of commendation saw the light. If Clare did not fall among thieves, he at least fell among blind bats. Literary England blotted her own escutcheon in the respect, but Scotland was saved from a similar disgrace by a noble outburst of praise for the poet, and scorn for his frigid countrymen, from the pen of Professor Wilson, in the course of which he adjured the Southrons to hold their tongues about the fate of Burns. Let them remember Bloomsfield. Had he but known all the evil circumstances that were combining to push John Clare in the direction of a lunatic asylum, his retort would have been strengthened to a degree melancholy to contemplate. Mental derangement advanced upon Clare with rapidity. In the spring of 1836 there was a brief period when the flowers made him a clear-minded partaker of their magic, but the improvement was not maintained, and little by little the condition of the poet became more widely known, till at last it reached the ears of several patrons. These advised his immediate removal to the asylum at Northampton. a plan to which Patty refused her consent, for she still had hopes that if her husband were allowed to range at his will and seek a cure from the pharmacy of nature, he would beat the disease. But Patty's love only delayed the inevitable. Clare, it is true, escaped from the control suggested by Earl Fitzwilliam, who endeavoured to place the poet at Northampton, where a weekly dole from the nobleman's purse would secure for the patient some additional comforts, but he had no whither to fly from the severe benefactions of the friends of former days. Mr. John Taylor and others, willing to heed now that the catastrophe to which their silence had contributed was come by its full dimensions, clubbed together and sent Clare to Dr. Allen's private lunatic asylum in Epping Forest, where all the resources of a humane treatment were brought to bear upon his case. He wrote a great quantity of verse, some of which was of real worth, tended the flowers in the garden beds, wandered about the woods hour after hour, smoking, musing, or conversing with some companion. In the middle of July, 1841, he escaped, and eventually reached Warrington, a hamlet lying beyond Peterborough. His chief food had been grass. Blood was trickling from his feet when Patty took the wanderer into her arms on the roadside at Warrington. After a day's rest at Northborough, the poet asked for pen and ink. When these were supplied, he commenced to write his Odyssey. It is almost safe to say that no more extraordinary a document belongs to the personal history of any genius born within our boundaries. It is of a character to draw tears from the unsympathetic. Your Scrooge, your Quilp, would scarcely withstand its pathos. Well might Christopher North request us to be done with our comments upon Scotland's usage of Burns. The rest is soon told. Clare, though quite harmless, was not allowed to pass free among the country sights and sounds. For some reason or another he was haled to the Northampton General Lunatic Asylum, where he remained for 22 years, neglected alike by kindred, by friends, and by the educated mob which had once made an idol of him. At the asylum he was treated with unvarying mildness by the authorities, who refused to regulate the comforts of the poet by the 11 shillings a week supplied by Earl Fitzwilliam. That their natures were not subservient to coinage, they proved by placing Clare, poor 11 shillings a week John Clare, among private patients in the best ward. The end came in 1864, and on the 25th of May in that year the mortal remnant of John Clare, peasant and poet, was interred at Helpstone. When Earl Fitzwilliam was asked for a grant of the few pounds necessary for the burial of the poet in the churchyard so beloved by him during his lifetime, he responded by suggesting that the funeral should be that of a pauper at Northampton. However, a few friends of the right heart prevented this disgrace, and the body rested where the soul had marked out for it a spot of greenery and quietude. That some of Clare's poems belong of right to the excellent things of this earth admits of no dispute. A worshipper of nature, by whom he was surely appointed to be one of her chief historians, he revelled in her manifestations, whether he showed in the higher heaven of blue or in the lower heaven of green. He was, if the phrases may pass muster, a gossip of the rainbow, a croony of the flowers. His heart was not less slow than that of Wordsworth to leap up with joy when he beheld standing across the sky, its feet treading the horizon, the most splendid triumphal arc ever devised, and though it was not granted him to render homage to his mistress in such large accents as those which fell from the lips of his great brother in song, he paid for her love and favours in music far from perishable, as may be noted by all who will read the pieces that have been selected for this volume from the Rural Muse. Who passes by any one of these poems because he early finds a flaw does so at his own danger, for each of them belongs, as I venture to assert, so undoubtedly to the particular treasures of pastoral poetry, that I doubt whether the contradiction of our greatest critics could frighten me from the attitude of admiration. To influences other than those of the countryside, Clare remained unimpressionable. To be in London was too long for Helpstone, the commons and pools of which were more precious to the poet than all the glories of Westminster Abbey, and the expanses of the artificial lakes. While he sojourned in the metropolis the right spark would not fall from heaven, but as soon as he wandered once more among the scenes so familiar to him, the muse was his unfailing companion. Brooks glided in his songs. Birds and clouds and leafage were foundations without which he had been well nigh powerless. He understood and was content with his limits, and so perfectly did he accomplish his duty as nature's cherished amanuensis, that it is no hard task for a man with an ounce of imagination in his being to hear the trickle of streams, and to fancy his study carpeted with grass, while reading John Clare's poems within four walls. As this volume of selections is designed for the purpose of attracting readers to a poet whose appreciative receipts from his posterity are sadly deficient in quantity, the publisher has thought well to ask from me the tale of Clare's life, rather than my views of the poet's work and its effect upon his successors in the production of poetry dealing almost exclusively with the vowels and consonants in nature's mighty alphabet. Enough has been said to prove the writer no half-hearted advocate, and if these few pages serve to increase the number of Clare's friends, he will be more than satisfied, happy in the thought that he has been the means of introducing readers to poetry as gentle as it is healing, as simple as it is sincere, touching its wholesomeness. How could it fail to delight in this respect when the chief of its constituent parts were the large and lovely expressions of nature's handicraft? John Clare's gift fell upon him direct from the skies. It came clean, and clean he kept it from the beginning to the end of his stewardship. Norman Gale. End of Part 3. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C.
What is Life? By John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Bruce Kachuk. And what is life? An hourglass on the run, a mist retreating from the morning sun, a busy, bustling, still repeated dream. Its length, a minute's pause, a moment's thought, and happiness, a bubble on the stream, that in the act of seizing shrinks to naught. What is vain hope? The puffing gale of morn that robs each floweret of its gem, and dies. A cobweb hiding disappointment's thorn, which stings more keenly through the thin disguise. And thou, O trouble? Nothing can suppose, and sure the power of wisdom only knows, what need requireth thee? So free and liberal as thy bounty flows, some necessary cause must surely be. But disappointments, pains, and every woe devoted wretches feel, the universal plagues of life below, are mysteries still 'neath Fate's unbroken seal. And what is death? Is still the cause unfound? That dark, mysterious name of horrid sound? A long and lingering sleep the weary crave. And peace? Where can its happiness abound? Nowhere at all, save heaven and the grave. Then what is life? When stripped of its disguise, a thing to be desired it cannot be, since everything that meets our foolish eyes gives proof sufficient of its vanity. 'Tis but a trial all must undergo, to teach unthankful mortals how to prize that happiness vain man's denied to know, until he's called to claim it in the skies. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
Address to Plenty by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. In Winter. O thou bliss, to riches known, stranger to the poor alone, giving most where none's required, leaving none where most desired, who, sworn friend to miser keeps, adding to his useless heaps gifts on gifts profusely stored, till thousands swell the mouldy hoard, while poor, shuddered Poverty, to advantage seen in me, with his rags he wants and pain, waking pity, but in vain, bowing, cringing at thy side, begs his mite and is denied. O thou blessing, let not me tell as vain my wants to thee, though by name of Plenty stilled, Fortune's heir, her favourite child. 'Tis a maxim, hunger feed, give the needy when they need. He whom all profess to serve the same maxim did observe. Their obedience hear how well Modern times will plainly tell. Hear my wants, nor deem me bold, not without occasion told. Hear one wish, nor fail to give, use me well, and bid me live. 'Tis not great, what I solicit, was it more, thou couldst not miss it. Now the cutting winter's come, 'tis but just to find a home, in some shelter, dry and warm, that will shield me from the storm. Toiling in the naked fields, where no bush a shelter yields, needy labour dithering stands, beats and blows his numbing hands, and upon the crumping snows stamps in vain to warm his toes. Leaves are fled that once had power to resist a summer shower, and the wind so piercing blows, winnowing small the drifting snows. The summer shade of loaded bough would vainly boast a shelter now. Piercing snows so searching fall, they sift a passage through them all. Those all's vain to keep him warm, Poverty must brave the storm. Friendship none its aid to lend, Health alone his only friend. granting leave to live in pain, giving strength to toil in vain, to be, while winter's horrors last, the sport of every pelting blast. O sad sons of poverty, victims doomed to misery, who can paint what pain prevails o'er that heart which want assails? Modest shame the pain conceals, no one knows but he who feels. O thou charm which plenty crowns, Fortune, smile, now winter frowns. Cast around a pitying eye, feed the hungry ere they die. Think, oh! think upon the poor, nor against them shut thy door. Freely let thy bounty flow on the sons of want and woe. Hills and dales no more are seen in their dress of pleasing green. Summer's robes are all thrown by for the clothing of the sky. Snows on snows in heaps combine, hillocks raised as mountains shine, and at distance rising proud, each appears a fleecy cloud. Plenty, now thy gifts bestow, exit bid to every woe. Take me in, shut out the blast, make the doors and windows fast, place me in some corner where, lolling in an elbow chair, happy blest to my desire, I may find a rousing fire, while in chimney corner nigh, coal or wood a fresh supply ready stands for laying on, soon as t'other's burnt and gone. Now and then, as taste decreed, in a book a page I'd read, an inquiry to amuse, peep at something in the news, see who's married and who's dead, and who, through bankrupt, beg their bread, while on hob or table nigh, just to drink before I'm dry, a pitcher at my side should stand, with the barrel nigh at hand, always ready as I willed, when 'twas empty to be filled, and to be possessed of all, a corner cupboard in the wall, with store of victuals lined complete, that when hungry I might eat. Then would I, in plenty's lap, for the first time take a nap, falling back in easy lair, sweetly slumbering in my chair, with no reflective thoughts to wake, pains that cause my heart to ache, of contracted debts, long made, in no prospect to be paid, and, to want sad news severe, of provisions getting dear, while the winter, shocking sight, constant freezes day and night, deep and deeper falls the snow, labor's slack, and wages low. These, and more, the poor can tell, known, alas, by them too well. Plenty, oh, if blessed by thee, never more should trouble me. Hours and weeks will sweetly glide, soft and smooth as flows the tide, where no stones or choking grass force a curve ere it can pass, and as happy and as blest as beasts drop them down to rest, when in pastures at their will they have roamed and eat their fill. Soft as nights in summer creep, so should I then fall asleep, while sweet visions of delight, so enchanting to the sight, sweetly swimming o'er my eyes, would sink me into ecstasies, nor would pleasured dreams once more, as they oft have done before, cause be to create a pain when I woke. to find them vain, bitter past the present sweet, would my happiness complete. Oh, how easy should I lie, with the fire up blazing high, summer's artificial bloom, that like an oven keeps the room, or lovely May as mild and warm, while without the raging storm is roaring in the chimney top, in no likelihood to drop, and the witchen branches nigh o'er my snug box, towering high, that sweet sheltered stands beneath, in convulsive eddies wreath. Then while, tyrant like, the storm takes delight in doing harm, down before him crushing all, till his weapons useless fall, and is in oppression proud, peal his howlings long and loud, while the clouds with horrid sweep give, as suits a tyrant's trade, the suns a minute's leave to peep, to smile upon the ruins made, and to make complete the blast, while the hail comes hard and fast, rattling loud against the glass, and the snowy sleets that pass, driving up in heaps remain, close adherings to the pane, stop the light and spread a gloom, suiting sleep around the room. Oh, how blest 'mid these alarms I should bask in Fortune's arms, who, defying every frown, hugs me on her doughy breast, bids my head lie easy down, and on winter's ruins rest. So upon the troubled sea, emblematic simile, birds are known to sit secure, while the billows roar and rave, slumbering in their safety sure, rocked to sleep upon the wave. So would I still slumber on, till our telling clocks had gone, and, from the contracted day, one or more had clicked away. Then with sitting wearied out, I for change's sake, no doubt, just might wish to leave my seat, and to exercise my feet, make a journey to the door, put my nose out, but no more, there to village taste agree, mark how times are like to be, how the weather's getting on, peep in ruts where carts have gone, or by stones a sturdy stroke, view the hole the boys have broke, Chrisling still inclined to freeze, and the rime upon the trees. Then to pause on ills to come, just look upward on the gloom, see fresh storms approaching fast, view them busy in the air, boiling up the brewing blast, still fresh horrors scheming there, black and dismal, rising high, from the north they fright the eye, pregnant with 1,000 storms, huddled in their icy arms, heavy hovering as they come, some as mountains seen, and some jagged as craggy rocks appear, dismally advancing near. Fancy as the cumbrous sight chills and shudders with affright, fearing lest the air in vain strive her station to maintain, and wearied, yielding to the skies, the world beneath in ruin lies. So may fancy think and feign, fancy oft imagines vain, Nature's laws by wisdom penned, mortals cannot comprehend. Power almighty being gave, endless mercy stoops to save, causes hid from mortal's sight, prove whatever is right. Then to look again below, Labor's former life I'd view, Who still beating through the snow, Spite of storms, their toils pursue, Forced out by sad necessity, That sad fiend that forces me, Troubles then no more my own, Which I but too long had known, Might create a care, a pain, Then I'd seek my joys again, Pile the fire up, fetch a drink, Then sit down again and think, Pause all my sorrows past, Think how many a bitter blast, When it snowed and hailed and blew, I have toiled and battered through, Then to ease reflective pain, To my sports I'd fall again, Till the clock had counted 10, When I'd seek my downy bed, Easy, happy, and well fed. Then might peep the morn in vain Through the rimy misted pane, Then might bawl the restless cock, And the loud tongued village clock, And the flail might lump away, Waking soon the dreary day, They should never waken me, Independent, blest, and free, Nor, as usual, make me start, Yawning sigh with heavy heart, Loth to ope my sleepy eyes, Weary still, in pain to rise, With aching bones and heavy head, Worse than when I went to bed, With nothing then to raise a sigh, Oh, how happy should I lie, Till the clock was 8 or more, Then proceed as heretofore. Best of blessings, sweetest charm, Boon these wishes while they're warm, My fairy visions ne'er despise, As reason thinks, though realize, Depressed with want and poverty, I sink, I fall, denied by thee. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. Noon by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. All how silent and how still, Nothing heard but yonder mill, While the dazzled eye surveys All around a liquid blaze, And amid the scorching gleams, If we earnest look, it seems As if crooked bits of glass Seemed repeatedly to pass. Oh, for a puffing breeze to blow, But breezes are all strangers now, Not a twig is seen to shake, Nor the smallest bent to quake. From the river's muddy side Not a curve is seen to glide, And no longer on the stream Watching lies the silver bream, Forcing from repeated springs Verges in successive rings. Bees are faint and cease to hum, Birds are overpowered and dumb, Rural voices all are mute, Tuneless lie the pipe and flute. Shepherds with their panting sheep In the swalest corner creep, And from the tormenting heat All are wishing to retreat. Huddled up in grass and flowers, Mowers wait for cooler hours, And the cowboy seeks the sedge, Ramping in the woodland hedge, While his cattle o'er the vales Scamper with uplifted tails. Others not so wild and mad That can better bear the gad, Underneath the hedgerow lunge, Or, if nigh, in waters plunge. Oh, to see how flowers are took, How it grieves me when I look. Rag robins, once so pink, Now are turned as black as ink, And the leaves being scorched so much, even crumble at the touch. Drowning lies the meadow sweet, flopping down beneath one's feet, while to all the flowers that blow, if in open air they grow, the injurious deed alike is done by the hot relentless sun, and the dew is parched up from the teazel's jointed cup. O poor birds, where must ye fly, now your water pots are dry? If ye stay upon the heath, ye'd be choked and clammed to death. Therefore leave the shadeless goss, seek the spring head lined with moss. There your little feet may stand, safely printing on the sand, while, in full possession where purling eddies ripple clear, you with ease and plenty blest, sip the coolest and the best. Then away, and wet your throats, cheer me with your warbling notes. 'Twill hot noon the more revive, while I wander to contrive for myself a place as good in the middle of a wood. There aside some mossy bank, where the grass in bunches, rank, lifts its down on spindles high, shall be where I'll choose to lie, fearless of the things that creep. There I'll think, and there I'll sleep, caring not to stir at all, till the dew begins to fall. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
The Universal Epitaph by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. No flattering praises daub my stone, my frailties and my faults to hide. My faults and failings all are known. I lived in sin I died. And oh, condemn me not, I pray, you who my sad confession view, but ask your soul if it can say that I'm a viler man than you. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
The Harvest Morning by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Cocks wake early morn with many a crow. Loud striking village clock has counted 4. The laboring rustic hears his restless foe, and weary of his pains, complaining sore, hobbles to fetch his horses from the moor. Some busy, 'gin to team the loaded corn, which nights thronged round the barn's becrowded door. Such plenteous scenes the farmer's yard adore, such noisy, busy toils now mark the harvest morn. The bird boy's pealing horn is loudly blowed, the waggons jostle on with rattling sound, and hogs and geese now throng the dusty road, grunting and gabbling in contention round the barley ears that litter on the ground. What printing traces mark the waggon's way? What busy bustling wains echo round? How drive the sun's warm beams the mist away? How labour sweats and toils and dreads the sultry day? His scythe the mower o'er his shoulder leans, and whetting, jars with sharp and tinkling sound, then sweeps again 'mong corn and crackling beans, and swath by swath flops lengthening o'er the ground, while 'neath some friendly heap, snug sheltered round From spoiling sun, lies hid the heart's delight, And hearty soaks oft hand the bottle round, Their toils pursuing with redoubted might. Great praise to him is due that brought its birth to light. Upon the wagon now with eager bound The lusty picker whirls the rustling sheaves, Or, resting ponderous creaking fork aground, Boastful at once wool shocks of barley heaves. The loading boy revengeful inly grieves To find his unmatched strength and power decay. The barley horn his garments interweaves, Smarting and sweating 'neath the sultry day. With muttering curses stung, he mauls the heaps away. A motley group the cleaning field surround. Sons of humanity, oh ne'er deny The humble gleaner entrance in your ground. Winter's sad cold and poverty are nigh. Grudge not from Providence the scant supply. You'll never miss it from your ample store. Who gives denial, hardened, hungry hound, May never blessings crowd his hated door, But he shall never lack that giveth to the poor. Ah, lovely Emma, mingling with the rest, Thy beauty's blooming in low life unseen, Thy rosy cheeks, thy sweetly swelling breast, But ill it suits thee in the stubs to glean. O Poverty, how basely you demean The imprisoned worth your rigid fates confine, Not fancied charms of an Arcadian queen, So sweet as Emma's real beauties shine. Had fortune blessed, sweet girl, this lot had ne'er been thine. The sun's increasing heat now mounted high, Refreshment must recruit exhausted power. The wagon stops, the busy tools thrown by, And 'neath a shocks enjoyed the bevering hour. The bashful maid, sweet health's engaging flower, Lingering behind, o'er rake still blushing bends, And when to take the horn fond swains implore, With feigned excuses its dislike pretends. So pass the bevering hours, so harvest morning ends. O rural life, what charms thy meanness hide! What sweet descriptions bards disdain to sing! What loves, what graces on thy plains abide! Oh, could I soar me on the Muses' wing, What rifled charms should my researches bring! Pleased would I wander where these charms reside, Of rural sports and beauties would I sing, Those beauties, wealth, which you in vain deride, Beauties of richest bloom, superior to your pride. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
On an Infant's Grave by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Beneath the sod where smiling creep the daisies into view, The ashes of an infant's sleep, whose soul as smiling too. Ah, doubly happy, doubly blest, had I so happy been, Recalled to heaven eternal rest, ere it knew how to sin. Thrice happy infant, great the bliss Alone reserved for thee, Such joy 'twas my sad fate to miss, And thy good luck to see. For oh, when all must rise again, And sentence then shall have, What crowds will wish with me in vain They'd filled an infant's grave. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
To an April Daisy by John Clare. By Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. Welcome, O comrade, peeping once again. Our meeting minds me of a pleasant hour. Spring's pencil pinks thee in that blushy stain, And summer glistens in thy tinty flower. Hail, beauty's gem, disdaining time nor place, Carelessly creeping on the dunghill's side. Demeanor's softness in thy crimpled face Decks thee in beauties unattained by pride. Hail, venturer, once again that fearless here Encampeth on the hoar hill's sunny side. Spring's early messenger! Thou'rt doubly dear, And winter's frost by thee is well supplied. Now winter's frowns shall cease their pelting rage, But winter's woes I need not tell to thee, Far better luck thy visits will presage, And be it thine and mine that luck to see. Ah, may thy smiles confirm the hopes they tell! To see thee frost bit I'd be grieved at heart. I meet thee happy, and I wish thee well, Till ripening summer summons us to part. Then like old mates or two who've neighbours been, We'll part, in hopes to meet another year, And o'er thy exit from this changing scene We'll mix our wishes in a tokening tear. End of poem. This reading is in the public domain. Summer Evening by John Clare. By Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. The sinking sun is taking leave, And sweetly gilds the edge of eve, While huddling clouds of purple dye Gloomily hang the western sky. Crows crowd cloaking overhead, Hastening to the woods to bed. Cooing sits the lonely dove, Calling home her absent love. With kerchup, kerchup, 'mong the wheats, Partridge distant partridge greets, Beckoning hints to those that roam, That guide the squandered covey home. Swallows check their winding flight, And twittering on the chimney light, Round the pond the martins flirt, Their snowy breasts bedaubed with dirt, While the mason, 'neath the slates, Each mortar bearing bird awaits. By art untaught, each labouring spouse Curious daubs his hanging house. Bats flit by in hood and cowl, Through the barn holes pops the owl From the hedge, in drowsy hum, Heedless buzzing beetles bum, Haunting every bushy place, Flopping in the labourer's face. Now the snail hath made his ring, And the moth with snowy wing Circles round in winding whirls, Through sweet evening's sprinkled pearls, On each nodding rush besprent, Dancing on from bent to bent. Now to downy grasses clung, Resting for a while he's hung, Strong to ferry o'er the stream, Vanishing as flies a dream. Playful still his hours to keep, Till his time has come to sleep, In tall grass by fountain head. Weary then he drops to bed. From the haycock's moistened heaps Startled frogs take vaunting leaps, And along the shaven mead, Jumping travellers, they proceed. Quick the dewy grass divides, Moistening sweet their speckled sides. From the grass or flow'ret's cup Quick the dewdrop bounces up. Now the blue fog creeps along, And the birds forget his song. Flowers now sleep within their hoods, Daisies button into buds, From soiling dew the buttercup Shuts his golden jewels up, And the rose and woodbine they Wait again the smiles of day. 'Neath the willow's wavy boughs Dolly singing milks her cows, While the brook, as bubbling by, Joins in murmuring melody. Dick and Dob, with jostling Joel, Homeward drag the rumbling roll. Whilom Ralph, for Doll to wait, Lulls him o'er the pasture gate. Swains to fold their sheep begin, Dogs loud barking drive them in. Hedgers now along the road Homeward bend beneath their load, And from the long furrowed seams Ploughmen loose their weary teams. Bull, with urging lashes wheeled, Still so slow to drive afield, Eager blundering from the plough, Wants no whip to drive him now. At the stable door he stands, Looking round for friendly hands, To loose the door its fastening pin, And let him with his corn begin. Round the yard, a thousand ways, Beasts in expectation gaze, Catching at the loads of hay, Passing fodders tug away. Hogs with grumbling, deafening noise Bother round the server boys, And far and near the motley group Anxious claim their suppering up. From the rest a blest release, Gabbling home the quarrelling geese Seek their warm straw littered shed, And waddling, prate away to bed. Nighted by unseen delay, Poking hens that lose their way On the hovelled rafters rise, Slumbering there the fox's prize. Now the cat has ta'en her seat, With her tail curled round her feet. Patiently she sits to watch Sparrows fighting on the thatch. Now Doll brings the expected pails, And dogs begin to wag their tails. With strokes and pats they're welcomed in, And they with looking once begin. Slove in the milk pail brimming o'er, She pops their dish behind the door. Prone to mischief boys are met, 'Neath the eaves the ladders set. Sly they climb in softest tread, To catch the sparrow on his bed. Massacred, oh, cruel pride! Dash against the ladder's side. Cursed barbarians, pass me by, Come not, Turks, my cottage nigh. Sure my sparrows are my own, Let ye then my birds alone. Come, poor birds, from foes severe, Fearless come, you're welcome here. My heart yearns at fate like yours, A sparrow's life as sweet as ours. Hardy clowns, grudge not the wheat Which hunger forces birds to eat. Your blinded eyes, worst foes to you, Can't see the good which sparrows do. Did not poor birds with watching rounds Pick up the insects from your grounds? Did they not tend your rising grain, You might then sow to reap in vain. Thus Providence, right understood, Whose end and aim is doing good, Sends nothing here without its use, Though ignorance loads it with abuse, And fools despise the blessing sent, And mock the giver's good intent. O God, let me what's good pursue, Let me the same to others do, As I'd have others do to me, And learn at least humanity. Dark and darker glooms the sky, Sleep gins close the labourer's eye. Dobson leaves his greensward seat, Neighbours where they neighbours meet, Crops to praise and work in hand, And battles tell from foreign land. while his pipe is puffing out, Sue he's putting to the rout, Gossiping, who takes delight To shool her knitting out at night, And backbite neighbours 'bout the town, Who's got new caps, and who's a gown, And many a thing her evil eye Can see they don't come honest by. Chattering at a neighbour's house, She hears call out her frowning spouse. Prepared to start, she soodles home, Her knitting twirling o'er her thumb, As, loth to leave, afraid to say, She bawls her story all the way, The tale so fraught with 'ticing charms, Her apron folded o'er her arms. She leaves the unfinished tale in pain To end as evening comes again, And in the cottage gangs with dread To meet old Dobson's timely frown, Who grumbled sits, prepared for bed, While she stands chalping 'bout the town. The night wind now, with sooty wings, In the quarter's chimney sings, Now, as stretching o'er the bed, Soft I raise my drowsy head, Listening to the ushering charms That shake the elm tree's mossy arms, Till sweet slumbers stronger creep, Deeper darkness stealing round, Then, as rocked, I sink to sleep, 'Mid the wild wind's lulling sound. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. Paddy by John Carr. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. Ye swampy falls of pasture ground, And rushy spreading greens, Ye rising swells in brambles bound, And freedom's wilder scenes, I've trod ye oft, and loved ye dear, And kind was fate to let me, On you I found my all, for here 'Twas first my Paddy met me. Flow on, thou gently plashing stream, O'er weed beds wild and rank, Delighted I've enjoyed my dream Upon thy mossy bank. Bemoistening many a weedy stem, I've watched thee wind so clearly, And on thy bank I've found the gem That makes me love thee dearly. Thou wilderness so rudely gay, Oft as I seek thy plain, Oft as I wend my steps away, And meet my joys again, And brush the weaving branches by Of briars and thorns so matty, So oft reflection warms a sigh, Here first I met my Paddy. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. Paddy of the Vale by John Carr. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. Where lonesome woodlands close surrounding Mark the spot a solitude, And nature's unchecked scenes abounding Form a prospect wild and rude, A cottage cheers the spot so glooming, Hid in the hollow of the dale, Where, in youth and beauty blooming, Lives sweet Paddy of the Vale. Gay as the lambs her cot surrounding, Sporting wild the shades among, O'er the hills and bushes bounding, Artless, innocent, and young, Fresh as blush of morning roses, Ere the midday suns prevail, Fair as lily bud uncloses, Blooms sweet Paddy of the Vale. Low and humble though her station, Dressed though mean she's doomed to wear, Few superiors in the nation With her beauty can compare. What are riches? Not worth naming, Though with some they may prevail, Theirs be choice of wealth proclaiming, Mine is Paddy of the Vale. Fools may fancy wealth and fortune join to make a happy pair, and for such the god importune with full many a fruitless prayer. I, their pride and wealth disdaining, should my humble hopes prevail, happy then, would cease complaining, blessed with Paddy of the Vale. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. My love, thou art a nosegay sweet, by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. My love, thou art a nosegay sweet, my sweetest flower I prove thee, and pleased I pin thee to my breast, and dearly do I love thee. And when my nosegay thou shalt fade, as sweet a flower thou it prove thee, and as thou witherest on my breast, for beauty past I'll love thee. And when my nosegay thou shalt die, and heaven's flower shall prove thee, my hope shall follow to the sky, and everlasting love thee. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
The Meeting by John Clare. Read for LibriVox.org by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C. Here we meet, too soon to part. Here to leave will raise a smart. Here I'll press thee to my heart, where none have place above thee. Here I vow to love thee well, and could words unseal the spell, had but language strength to tell, I'd say how much I love thee. Here the rose that decks thy door, here the thorn that spreads thy bower, here the willow on the moor, the birds at rest above thee. Had they light of life to see, sense of soul like thee and me, soon might each a witness be how dotingly I love thee. By the night sky's purple ether, and by even's sweetest weather, that oft has blessed us both together, the moon that shines above thee, and shews thy beauteous cheek so blooming, and by pale age's winter coming, the charms and casualties of woman, I will forever love thee. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.